Now, most of the time that you'll spend as a security analyst is going to be about trying to keep the bad guys out. And you're not going to be using your fists for this, you will need some tools. And most of the time it's going to be about something that you need to change in the network, something that you need to add, even something that you need to remove from the network because things become obsolete. Well, when we say something, we actually refer to any piece of hardware or software, or even a specific configuration of a device that has some security implications for us, that helps us improve our security posture. And that something is what we'll call a security control. For a long time, we've seen security implemented in some sort of a reactive way, and a lot of companies are still doing this nowadays. That is, they just wait for a threat to become real enough to actually be threatening to their company before they actually take some action. And we've kind of grown used to thinking about attacks in two different categories. The first one being what we call cross-network attacks. So attacks that come across the network or over some network from somebody else's network, for example. And we've had some ways to mitigate those. Things like firewalls and IPSs and some classic devices that do, starting from basic NAT up to layer 7 filtering, for example. And the second category would be related to those so-called host-based attacks, like viruses, worms, trojans, anything that attacks a specific host, and it might come or it might not come over a specific network, but it definitely targets a specific host. And we've had ways to mitigate those as well. Number one being the firewalls and the security suites that we install on our working devices. But nowadays the problem is that things aren't so simple anymore. We cannot just wait for an attack to happen. We have to try to prevent them before they occur, because when we detect them, if we keep being reactive, it might be too late. There's so many businesses nowadays that completely rely on IT infrastructure and IT services that being reactive like we were used to, it's just too risky. So the bottom line would be, for once, let's just try being proactive about security. Let's not wait for things to happen before we take action. But unfortunately, there are just so many unknowns that this is going to be a very tough mission. And for this, we're going to take a structured approach. And the first step in this structured approach would be to have a well-defined asset inventory and classification. That is, just like we've mentioned some videos ago, what exactly do we want to protect? And also, evaluate those assets, evaluate their value to you, to your business, and try to answer the question, are they worth protecting? Are they worth any security investment in order to keep them safe? Secondly, try to implement risk management. Now, risk management basically boils down to evaluate all the potential risks that can affect you, right? And also think about how likely are those risks to happen if a specific attack is going to happen on a specific host. So how likely is that threat to your environment? And third, think about what security controls, what hardware or software solutions you can implement to improve your security posture. And we're going to talk about the classification of security controls because there are just so many ways that we can approach this problem. And unfortunately, there is no silver bullet. There is no magical single networking security device out there that we can enable and that can help us feel safe forever and ever, right? We need them to complement each other. So again, we're going to need a structured approach when we choose security controls as well. All right, so let's start with the last one, this security controls right here, because it's the easiest one to understand right now. A security control is something that you install in your network and protects your company, protects your network basically. So at the end of the day, we can think about security controls as some sort of device or hardware device or software solution that helps you with confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Or even non-repudiation, that is the inability of a person or any subject or entity to deny having performed a specific action. That's very important for data integrity and for accountability, but that's going to be a bit more specific, only for certain environments. So we have a number of ways to categorize security controls, and before we dig deeper into any type of classification, it's important to have these categories because when we try to implement these security controls, The idea is that we try to make them complement each other, like having different security controls from different categories installed at the same time. This is what provides us with that defense in depth. And the first well-known and widely recognized way of categorizing security controls is the one defined by NIST. That's the National Institute of Standards and Technology. Actually, this type of categorization is described into special publication 800-53. Probably the only publication that you really need to remember for the exam. Right, and we start first with technical or logical controls. Now, what exactly do we mean by technical controls? Basically, we mean something that can be called a system. For example, a firewall, an access control system, a proxy, any software or hardware, or even a specific configuration that helps us keep the bad guys away. So that's a technical or logical control. This is also where we find specialized systems as well, not just general purpose firewalls and IPSs, but also things like web application firewalls. One example would be, actually two examples here, would be the first one being the open source web application firewall from Apache called Mod Security. We also have a web application firewall for IIS. That's another way we can implement it in a completely free and open source way. Of course, we do have specialized solutions, equipment, or software solutions from other vendors out there, paid vendors, like for example FortiWeb from Fortinet. And another type of specialized system would be, for example, a database firewall, which scans the traffic going towards the database and tries to look for specific known attack patterns, like SQL injections or privilege escalation attacks that attempt to reveal more information or corrupt the database. So we do have all these technical or logical controls here, which are basically ways to implement some sort of hardware or software device that keeps us safe. Secondly, we have operational controls, also known in specific publications as administrative controls. And this is where we focus on things that can be implemented by using people, real people. Things like trainings that you conduct for your employees or your partners, the security trainings that everybody must attend in a company, or security guards that you hire in order to protect your perimeter, your building. So people are security controls as well. And finally, we have management controls. Now, management controls are considered to be a high-level overview or refer to a high-level overview of your security system. This is where we find, for example, regulations or procedures or any documentation or piece of information that help you with choosing one type of control over another. So this is where we think about what kind of documents are you going to review when you need to choose a specific firewall, for example, for your company. Also, the same documentation, the same management controls that we've been talking about are the ones that are going to help you with risk assessments, because those documents are going to help you decide what is critical for your infrastructure and where do you need to focus your efforts when you want to protect it. Now, this is not the best classification, in my opinion, because it does create a lot of confusion. There are a lot of gray areas in here, as you probably guessed already. An example of such a confusion would be the fact that NIST says that planning, the act of planning for security is a management control, but the act of contingency planning, planning for disasters with regards to security, is an operational control. So which one is which? Pretty hard to decide. Now, a better classification, I would say, even though it's a bit more granular this time, is by the goals that they perform, their purpose. And by the way, this is going to be a very important exam topic, so don't glance over this one. And we start here with preventative controls. The preventative controls are supposed to reduce or even completely eliminate, in an ideal world, the possibility of an attack. This is where we think about those controls that actually enforce some policy that keeps the bad guys away. So an example here would be simple firewall rules or firewall policies or the antivirus signatures that you have installed on your workstations. And with regards to the attack continuum, as in what happens before, during, and after an attack, these preventative controls, of course, are going to become important before the attack takes place. So we install preventative controls to actually prevent the attack. Preventative controls might sound a bit useless at first because they don't stop an attack. They actually do nothing to stop the attack, but they do notify you. Those are the controls that generate alerts, logs, any proof that you need to review during or after the attack in order to understand what really happened in there. Then we have corrective controls, and these corrective controls are going to come into play after the attack. Now, you might ask, what can you do after the attack has already completed? Well, after the attack, of course, you might want to restore your business, right? Bring it back to compliance, bring it back to operation level. So this is where things like backup and restore comes into play. Now, after an attack, assuming that the attack was successful, some data loss, some data corruption happened, a restore from a properly maintained backup is going to save the day. And also, don't forget about patching. This is also where patching comes into play. You have been breached, the attack was successful. Those things are not good news, of course, but at least do something to prevent it occurring a second time. So see what vulnerabilities were targeted and try to patch them. This is also a corrective control. And a couple of bonus ones. Don't forget about physical controls. And yes, we are talking here about locks, doors, fences. Don't forget to lock your door when you leave your home, right? Regardless of what state-of-the-art security system you have in your home, if you don't lock your door, well, that's going to be a major vulnerability. So these are the security controls in the physical category. Of course, they're going to prevent the attack as well. Then we have deterrent, not detergent, but deterrent. That's something that's preventative in a manner that discourages the attack from taking place from the very beginning. So it not only stops the attack, actually doesn't stop the attack, but discourages the attacker from even attempting the attack. Now, what kind of controls could we have here? This is where we could cover things like warning signs that you are being surveilled or the trespassers would be prosecuted. Also, security guards or security dogs even. The simple presence of a security guard is most likely going to discourage a large percentage of potential intruders into your building. Cameras as well, video cameras, CCTV, closed circuit television, that's also going to be a deterrent. Of course, it's also going to be detective. It helps you detect if a breach has happened, but a camera system, a visible camera system, is also going to discourage potential intruders. And of course, you also have here the opportunity to install fake video cameras, which are of course going to be deterrent only because they're not going to be able to detect anything, but they're still going to discourage, let's say, potentially lower skilled intruders. And finally, we have compensating controls. Now, this one here, the last one, is a bit weird because compensating controls, you have to think of them something on the lines of, if we cannot protect this the right way, the way we're supposed to protect it, well then at least we're doing this. So that's a compensating control. It substitutes, complements, to put it in a more elegant way, a main control, just in case the main control cannot be implemented. Now, why couldn't we implement a specific control for a specific kind of threat? Well, it might be because that control is just prohibitively expensive. We cannot afford it, right? Or some business requirements don't allow us to implement that specific control, or even some technical requirements. Now, this concept was introduced by PCI DSS, and it kind of makes sense when it comes to compliance, as its purpose is to deploy a control that does the same job as the recommended one, but using a different method, in a different manner. Now, I wouldn't say in an unorthodox manner, but it's still going to be a different manner. Now, the problem with compensating controls is that they have to be thoroughly documented and then formally approved, and keep this detail in mind for the exam as well, because if you think about it, well, I'm not going to install a firewall, but I'm going to do some patchwork in there that's using a Linux server, redirect the traffic towards a Raspberry Pi or something like that, which of course is not going to provide you the same security or performance like a normal firewall, which means that that control is to be expected to perform worse and not to improve your security the way a normal firewall would be able to. So that's why you have to formally approve these type of controls, because they are non-standard. They're just workarounds. And well, as you may notice, we can have another round at the guessing game right here, because, for example, security guards, are they considered to be preventative? Yes. Detective? Yes, they can detect. Are they deterrent? Do they discourage? Yes, they do as well. So there you have it, right? There's no universal way to categorize security controls, at least not by assigning one to a very specific category. Now, an equally important step after we've selected our desired security controls is to test them, to evaluate them, because we need to be sure that the controls comply with our needs and expectations. And we have a number of ways of doing this. We can start with quality control. This is something that's usually done in the factory. You don't do it by yourself. It's done by the manufacturer. And it's designed to determine if the device or the software solution is free from defects. Does it boot up, and does all its components spin up and work properly? Now, there is something you can also do on your side, which is, for example, to check if the device is dead on arrival, or if some components don't work properly when you actually take it out of the box. Or at least check if the firewall wasn't dropped on the stairs by the delivery person, right? So quality control is part of the quality assurance process, which describes what exactly do we understand by quality, what can we expect from the product, and how it was measured. Now, when it's about software, then quality control and quality assurance become something called as verification and validation. Verification, first, this is more of a compliance testing process, and it's basically aimed to give an answer to the question, does this piece of hardware or software meet the requirements of our design or our framework? Second, we have validation, which answers the question, does it do what we want it to do? Is this the right fit for our specific environment? For example, you can use a firewall to keep malware out of the building, but you're not going to use a firewall to keep the burglars out of the building, right? And finally, interpreting the answers to these questions can be formalized in something that is called evaluation and then assessment. Starting with assessments. An assessment is about subjecting that product to a checklist of requirements. Things like, is the firewall properly configured? Is the antivirus security suite installed on all our employee workstations? Now, on the other hand, evaluation is much more subjective because humans have to evaluate the control's usefulness, usually for the purpose of proving that the control is properly doing its job. So it's related to continuous monitoring of the performance and of how fit that security control is for our specific environment. Does it protect what we want it to protect? And does it do it in an efficient manner? Now, of course, both evaluation and assessments are going to be much more useful if they somehow can take into consideration the current state of your environment. This way, you can identify problem areas and find out what needs to be fixed and where should the investments go. Now, auditing is a somewhat similar process to evaluation and assessments, but it's more formal, perhaps even more rigid. Now, audits involve a predefined baseline, and they're aimed at finding faults of non-compliance of your environment versus that baseline. Now, if it sounds like a compliance or regulations check, it is. Most regulated industries require such audits actually to validate compliance. And when it comes to security controls, one last thing that you need to remember is about monitoring. You're also going to find it under the names of continuous monitoring, or CSM, that's continuous security monitoring. And it's nothing more than a continuous process of risk assessment. And the purpose of this CSM, continuous security monitoring, is to track anything that can be involved in a security incident in a company. It can be anything related to network traffic, communications, any data exposure, hosts, endpoints, business operations. Of course, all these need to be tracked, measured, using finely tuned algorithms and systems that can quickly detect and log any issues. Basically, continuous monitoring is that magical method of turning reactive processes into proactive ones when it comes to cybersecurity. But unfortunately, it's costly. It's time-consuming, requires well-trained, well-paid, and well-motivated staff. But the good news is that it can also keep most threats at bay from touching you. And luckily, a lot of tools can partially automate this process. I'm going to see a couple of those tools in the next videos. Alright, so for the exam, make sure you understand what a security control is and what it's supposed to do. And make sure you remember the categories that we've discussed, starting with the NIST categories of technical, logical, operational, or administrative management, and following with the security controls by the goals that they perform, the ones that we've mentioned just a couple of minutes ago, and I'm just going to reiterate them. Just make sure you know at least one example out of each category here. Those categories being preventative, detective, corrective, physical, deterrent, and compensating. Alright, thanks for watching, good luck on the exam, don't forget to like and subscribe, and see you on the next episode.